Hello 9 and 10, it is Miss Jewis here again for your lesson today, and we are going to be looking at the poem Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. So to start with, for a do now, could you match the words on the side there to the correct definition? So pause the video now and do that. Okay, so what we've got here are some words that are all linked to the poem. So we'll quickly go through the definitions. So number one, a pilot is number four, a person who operates an aeroplane. Hopefully we got that. Number two, an ally is the definition three, a state or nation formally cooperating with another for a military or other purpose. Number three, shunned, goes with number five, which is to be rejected or avoided by all. And number four, honour, goes with number two, the quality of knowing and doing what is morally right. And then number five, duty, it goes with definition number one, a moral or legal obligation, a responsibility. Okay, so those ideas about honour, duty, being shunned are really important in this poem. So what we're going to be looking at is ideas about conflict, ideas about nature, and ideas about identity with the poem today. Okay. So, our learning outcomes. We're obviously going to revise the poem Kamikaze. We're also going to discuss the effect of perspective in this poem, because that is quite interesting how the poet uses it. We're going to read the poem, answer questions on it. And this is one of the poems in the GCSE anthology for your English literature exam. In the exam you will be given one poem and need to compare it with another, so it is really important that you do know the poems really well. Okay, let's start off with a bit of context. So, kamikaze is a word that the Japanese used in the Second World War. So this term was used for the Japanese fighter pilots who were sent on suicide missions. They were expected to crash their warplanes into enemy warships. That word kamikaze, it translates as divine wind. It refers to a typhoon that destroyed an enemy fleet in the 13th century. So on the side there you can see some pictures of kamikaze pilots during the Second World War. I want you to consider these two questions here. Okay, so I'll read them out and then you can pause the video, have a think about them. So the first question, why would these pilots volunteer or agree to take their own lives? Have a think back to the words from the do now to help you answer. And the second question, do you think that these pilots saw it as their duty to take their life? So do you think that is right? Okay, so pause the video, have a think about those couple of questions. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide and we'll sort of have a think about those two questions and why these. So Japan is known as the land of the rising sun, quite famously. When we think of Japan, you might think of modern Japan as quite a peaceful country. However, in its history, it's had its fair share of war and a very diverse culture compared to our own. So it's sort of a very famous military country. Japan is a very spiritual country with deep codes of honour, and these are just as important as law to many of its people. The idea of your family honour is more important than your own personal life, and you'd be expected to sacrifice your own well-being in the service of your family, country and the emperor. Okay, so that idea of honour and having a moral sort of duty to be honourable, so if that meant taking your own life, then they had to do it. As a result, when called to kamikaze, many Japanese saw it as their duty, and they did so voluntarily, knowing that they would bring honour to their family, to their community. However, if they didn't do this, they were disowned by their family, treated as an embarrassment, and many families would throw them out or ignore them, even their own wife and children would behave as if they were dead. So it was very important for them to fulfill their honour and their duty. This is a rising flag sun, which is sort of the Japanese flag of their military. In this narrative poem, so it's a narrative poem because it tells us a story about something that happened, Beatrice Garland explores the testimony of the daughter of a kamikaze pilot. And unlike many of his comrades, this pilot returns back from his target, he returns from his mission, and he goes home. The poem explores the moment that the pilot's decision is made and sketches out the consequences for him over the rest of his life. He's not only shunned by his neighbours, but his wife refuses to speak to him or look him in the eye. His children too, they gradually learn that he's not to be spoken to, and they begin to isolate and reject him. So this poem is quite a straightforward poem, but one thing that gets a little bit complicated is there are sort of 4 generations explored in this poem. So the poem is told by the pilot's daughter, who is the narrator, and she's telling the story of this kamikaze pilot to her children. So she talks about her father in this story, the kamikaze pilot, and also talks about his father, okay, who's the fisherman. So just kind of have a look at that image there that I've just put up, so you don't get confused when we're reading sort of who's talking and then who all the different characters are in the story, basically. Okay, so before we start reading the poem, we are going to have a look at some key vocabulary. Again, we'll go through the key words. If you're not sure of the definition, then please do write it down so that you can remember it. So the first word is embarked. This means to begin something, and it's usually something exciting. So you would embark on a journey or an adventure. You wouldn't necessarily embark to go to the shops. Incantations are spells, another word for spells, so sort of magic. Swathes, this is a broad strip or area of something, usually like in a field. Shoals is a group of fish. Cairns is a pile of stone or pebbles, and usually acts as a memorial or a marker, so almost like a tombstone. Then you've got turbulent, which is when something moves very unsteadily or violently. It's turbulent. Okay, so have a look at those words. Write down any that you don't know or are unsure of, because you will need them as we read through the poem. Okay, so let's start having a look at the poem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first 2 stanzas here. I might explain a little bit what it means as we go, and then I'm going to put up some questions for you to answer. So the poem starts off. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. So the start of the poem here, we have him starting his journey as a kamikaze pilot. He's going on a one-way journey, so we know he's a kamikaze pilot. He's not expected to return. And then we have an idea of what he saw, what he would have looked at as he was on his journey. So here are some questions. I'd like you to pause the video now, work through those questions, and then come back and we will go through the answers. Okay, so question number 1 is, what is the significance of the word sunrise in line 1? So we've got her father embarked at sunrise. Sunrise, it links to Japan being that land of the rising sun. It helps us understand that he's that kamikaze pilot. at war. Sunrise is also quite a hopeful image of new day, so it could maybe suggest in that first line that is quite an exciting adventure journey that he's on, or he thinks he is at the moment. Question 2 is, why does the pilot carry a sword and not a gun? So it says he's there with a samurai sword. Okay. This is really symbolic of sort of Japanese warriors and that heritage. Number 3, what is the significance of the noun incantations in line 4? So it says as he's there about to go on this journey, his head is full of powerful incantations, so spells. That gives us the impression that he is maybe brainwashed. Okay? His head has been filled with these ideas of honour, these ideas that this is going to be an exciting journey, when really it's not. So it's the idea that he's probably been brainwashed by his culture, by society, by the government, about this war, about what he's about to do. Number 5, the poem, what perspective is the poem written in and why? So at this point, it's written in the third person. Okay, so it's from the perspective of the daughter, but in the third person. So it's talking about her father and what he must have thought. It might be in the third person to symbolise a sort of distance between the father and the daughter who's telling this story. Okay, she's not saying my father, it's saying her father. So there's some distance there between them. In line 9, the modal verb must is used. Okay, he must have looked far down. That could be telling us that he is, that the daughter, she doesn't actually know what he did. It's not saying that he did look down, it's saying he must have looked down. So perhaps the daughter doesn't actually know. Maybe she never actually asked her father what he thought when he was flying over the sea. So again, that sense of distance perhaps between the daughter and the father. Number 7, what device is used in line 11 and what is the effect? So as he's flying over the sea, it says that he looked down at the fishing boat strung out like bunting. That is a simile there. And it creates quite a happy image. Okay, that's the effect of it. It creates a happy image. Bunting we tend to associate with maybe celebrations, parties. So he looks down and he sees this really happy image. And number 8, what does line 12 show the reader about nature? So he's looking down on the green-blue translucent sea. So he's flying over the sea, looking down at it. And that description of the sea there as green-blue translucent is a really beautiful image. Okay, so he looks down at the beauty of nature. Okay, and it's this beauty in nature that ultimately makes him change his mind. Okay. If you had something different to what I've just said, then your interpretations can be entirely correct as well. I've just given you my perspective on those questions. Okay, let's have a look at the next couple of stanzas. So the poem carries on. It says, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag wave first one way and then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers waiting on the shore built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood the longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. Okay, so this section of the poem, we have the pilot looking down at the sea. He sees these fish, he's kind of enamoured by them, the way he's watching them, and then we get a childhood memory of his. He remembers him and his brothers waiting for his father. Okay, so the her grandfather who's telling the story, waiting for him to come back. He was a fisherman, so waiting for him to come back from the sea. So here are some questions on these 3 stanzas. Pause the video again now, answer those questions as best you can in as much detail as you can, and then when you come back we will go through them. Okay, so the first question there says, what device is used in line 14? What is the effect? So looking down, he sees the fish arcing in swathes, so you can imagine there's a huge number of fish that he's looking down on. It looks like one big patch of fish in the sea. So they're waved like a flag. So we've got a simile there, another one. And waving a flag, this could be symbolic of sort of waving the white flag in surrender. It could be him maybe deciding he doesn't want to necessarily carry on with his journey. Number 2, what devices are used in lines 16 to 17? What is the effect? So we've got dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. We have got a lot of S sounds in there, which is the device of sibilance. Okay, and this sibilance makes quite a smooth sound. It could be reflecting the natural movement of the fish. Most makes it sound quite calming. Number 3, in line 18, why is the motion of swivelling important? It says looking down at these fish, it says they swiveled towards the sun. That verb there could possibly reflect the Kamikaze pilots, how their planes would swivel. Okay, so he's seeing some connection between the nature down below him and what he is intending to do. Okay, moving into the next stanza, we go back to a childhood memory of the pilots. So question number 4 is, in line 21, what image is created? So he's talking about when he was younger, he would wait for his father to come back from sea, and they built cairns of pearl grey pebbles. So if you remember, a cairn is sort of pebbles stacked on top of each other that could represent a grave or a memorial. So this creates an imagery of death, okay, which is quite dark imagery. Number 5, why does the pilot recall a memory of waiting for his father to return home? So he remembers his father returning home from the sea. It says on line 24 there, bringing his father's boat safe. Okay, he's probably connecting this with what he's going through. Okay, he's out at sea at the moment, flying over the sea. It might be reflecting that perhaps he wants to be brought back safely home for his own children. Okay. Question number 6, line 25, what do the italics represent? So when she says there, yes, grandfather's boat, it's almost a change of perspective, a change of voice there when it's in italics. In the poem, whenever it changes to italics, it changes into the first person. So there, it's almost like she's answered a question from one of her children who she's telling this story to. Okay. And then the rest of this stanza here, we've got a list of all the different fish that his father had got from being out fishing, and it kind of just represents how plentiful life is. All those fish could represent life for this pilot. And then the last thing there on line 30, it says that once his father caught a tuna, the dark prince, muscular and dangerous. So we've got a metaphor there calling this tuna a dark prince, and what that could represent is perhaps the power of nature. Okay, here nature seems more powerful, more dangerous than anybody else. Okay, it could also maybe represent the pilot himself. He's thinking about all this life in the sea, everybody else's life that they are living, but he's separated from that. He's the lone tuner, dangerous. He's going to take other people's lives if he carries out this mission. So he might be identifying himself with this lone tuner, which maybe he doesn't sort of want that comparison. It's making him change his mind on the mission that he's on. Okay, and let's look at the last bit of the so this bit is now all in italics, so we can see that it's changed into the first person from his daughter's perspective. So she says, "And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, and that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes," she said, "he must have wondered which had been the better way to die." Okay. So we get a sense of what happened to the pilot when he returned home in these two stanzas. So just 4 questions on this bit. Again, pause the video now, answer those questions there, and then when you come back we will go through the answers. Okay, so we've got question number 1. From this point, what perspective is the poem written in? Why does it change? So I already mentioned it changes into the first person. Why it changes? It could be the daughter sort of coming to terms with how she felt about her father. It could be switching perspective because of the conflict she feels or the guilt she feels, how she is distant from her father because she didn't speak to him, how she now feels quite guilty about that. Number 2, why is it only the children who will talk to the pilot? As children, they probably haven't learned the societal expectations, what society expects of them in terms of honour and duty. So they maybe don't realise that the father has done anything wrong. But it says that they then learned to be silent. So they learned he'd done something wrong in returning home, according to them, and they learned not to talk to him either. So all of society shunned him. But you've got that idea of a childhood innocence they still don't realise. Number 3, what does the final line of the poem suggest? So the final line says, "Sometimes he must have wondered which had been the better way to die." What it means by this is that if he would have fulfilled his mission, he would have died a physical death. Okay, he would have died in his body. But when he came home, it was like he died an emotional death. Okay, so he lost himself, he lost his family, he lost his friends. He wasn't the same person when he returned. So he did die an emotional death in a way. And that's quite a sad line because it suggests that in abandoning his mission, it was all quite futile. Okay, like there was no point to it. Question number 4 that says, throughout the poem, the pilot contrasts dark and light imagery. What could this represent? So that could represent for us how he's got this inner conflict. Okay, in this whole poem, there's this conflict between his cultural expectations of him. Okay, so this idea that society expects him to go and give his life for the war and for his country. And then there's this conflict that he's got his own conscience, he's got his own family, he sees all this beauty in nature and he doesn't want to take that life. Okay, so there's a conflict between personal and national. Okay, him acting for his country and then him acting for himself. So the positive, negative language could reflect that conflict that's happening within him as he's flying his plane and then decides to return home. Okay, so a little bit on the structure of the poem and how this helps us to understand meaning. So as we go through this, make a couple of notes on your page, whatever you're writing on. Okay, so the poem is made up of 7 stanzas, each with 6 lines. This is quite a tight, rigid structure, and this could reflect how the military is quite controlling with tight restrictions. He hasn't got any room to not do what they're asking, so that's what the structure of the stanzas could represent. However, within that tight structure, the poet uses free verse, which means there's no rhyme or rhythm, and enjambment, which hopefully we remember is when the lines flow into one another. Those 2 things there make it sound like natural speech, as if we're hearing a story. And what that could reflect is how the pilot fights these tight restrictions of the military and how he wants to be free. Okay, so even though he's restricted, which is represented in those stanzas, he fights against that, which is why we don't have a regular structure in the lines within the stanzas. Okay. The narrative voice starts in the 3rd person, which could reflect the distance that the daughter has with her father. We've already discussed that a little bit throughout the poem. Okay, so there's some main structural points. Again, like I said in my prelude lesson, it is important that you can comment on structure if you are aiming for those top marks in your GCSE. Okay, so pause the video now, make a note of some of the information on there. Okay, and we're going to finish off with a paragraph, which is everyone's favourite. I just want you to try and do 1 paragraph today. I want to focus on how does Garland present ideas about conflict in Kamikaze? Okay, how does she present ideas about conflict? So you could focus on conflict of war. Okay, what is expected to do. You could focus on inner conflict, how the pilot himself is feeling. Okay. As a star challenge there, we've got, can you compare how Garland presents conflict to another poem? Consider linking to exposure. Okay, you've already read exposure. If you can, you could try and link to the prelude and think about how there's a conflict with nature, possibly. Okay, but if you can, try to compare it to another poem, but try and get done at least 1 paragraph. So pause the video now and have a go at that. Okay, hopefully we've done that. Can you make sure that you do email your paragraph to your teacher so you can get some feedback on that? And to finish off, I just want you to sum up what you think the poet is trying to say through his poem. So have a think about those themes of nature, war and inner conflict, and just a couple of sentences. What is the poet trying to say throughout the poem? Okay, hopefully we've done that, and that is the end of your lesson on Kamikaze. So do remember to email your work to your teacher, and I will speak to you next time. Okay, hope you're all doing well. Bye.